Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from What Kind of Man at YouTube with another on location video from Supanova the previous weekend. They've got a bit of a more modelling flavour to the event and invited Runway 13, a long-time trader at Model Expo, to do a demonstration on airbrushing. Now, a bit of a background. This gentleman has placed an airbrush in my hand and taught me a few tricks. When I told him I felt quite unconfident in using the tools I already had at home, even though he wasn't going to make a sale, he taught me, and I consider him one of my earlier teachers. He's a very old school modeler with 1980-ish resin kits, and is quite experienced and skilled from the work he's displayed I've seen. Nonetheless, this would be a fantastic introduction to anyone who's starting out. I'll put a link to his website down below, which he sells airbrushes, compressors and other accessories which are excellent models and reasonably priced. Enjoy this presentation.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. This is the, I think it's been called the Airbrushing Basics Workshop. My name is Peter Shump. I'm from Runway 13. We're a specialist supplier of popping tools and airbrushing equipment. This is a little bit of an unscripted workshop, just a little bit ill-prepared for all that, so please forgive me, be patient with me about it. I'm going to start by asking people here to put up their hand who has actually had a go, who does airbrushing or at least has had a go at one. 1, 2, 3. A few people around. Okay. Out of those who have had a go, do you feel comfortable with the airbrush, or do you feel a little bit uncomfortable and want some advice on it? Okay, for the other people who at least know who's interested in getting into airbrushing. Okay, can I ask, just to get some idea, a couple of people just raise their hands and say what they want to do with airbrush? Sorry, I can't on canvas and things. Okay, so we got some people who are interested on canvas. Immediately, I'm mainly do airbrushing for actual models themselves, but the techniques don't vary a great deal between different types of work and different mediums. So the basics are the same. So what I'm going to do is start off with just to mention a few basics about airbrushes. Mention a bit of jargon of airbrushes, how it's set up and things, and then we'll go through a little bit of demonstration as well. Just showing you here, right here on this stand, some of the works that I've done with airbrushes as part of my hobby. Just painted figures, painted aircraft, cars, and that sort of thing. I'm also, you can also do it for things like weathering on model railroad. All those things are equally applicable to the many models you see behind you as well. So some of the things that I do here, even though it's been done on other models, completely different models behind you, the same techniques apply. So I'll start off with some real basics. An airbrushing system is basically something that lets you spray paint or other sort of things in mediums. It consists mainly of two parts. This is the airbrush itself, and it's also powered by an air compressor which supplies the air. It's like a miniature spray gun, effectively. When you look into airbrushes, there's one of the first bit of jargon people come across is something called double action or single action. Anybody familiar with the term double action here? Okay, a couple of people, that's okay. For those who are not familiar with it, I'll explain what it meant by single action airbrush first. Okay, a single action airbrush is an airbrush that you press down for air, trigger for air, and you adjust the paint, how much paint's come out, in a separate control either at the front or the back of the airbrush. Okay, the reason people use single action airbrushes is because single action airbrushes tend to be simpler, they're a little bit easier to learn at first, but they don't give you quite as much control as a double action airbrush. Okay, so a lot of people do start with single action airbrushes, and I can certainly show people at our stand what single action airbrush looks like. The airbrush I got here is actually what's called a double action airbrush. The difference is you press down for air, just like a single action airbrush, but the control for the paint is also on the trigger by pulling backwards. Okay, so you press down for air, and on the same trigger you can control the amount of paint by progressively pulling back on the trigger. It means you control both, hence both air and paint, and hence the term double action. Okay, the thing about double action airbrushes is they are mechanically a little more complicated and delicate. They are harder to learn at first because you're trying to control both with a single finger, but it gives you much more control over your work. So if you're doing a lot of fine work, you're doing a lot of special effects with the airbrush, a double action airbrush is more suited for that. Okay, but it is a little harder to learn. What we say at Runway 13 is we in general recommend even beginners to pick up from a double action airbrush straight off. Yes, we know it's hard to learn at first, but once you put in a little bit of practice, it's actually easier afterwards. You get more control. And it's a way I learned myself. I went straight to a double action airbrush and will practice. I actually now find it harder to airbrush with a single action airbrush. So, because of that extra control. So just to demonstrate that effect, I'm going to make sure people can see this. I'm just going to press down the button on that airbrush. And you don't see any paint. But if I start pulling back on that button or trigger, you can see you may be able to see a bit of orange. Okay, but if I pull back considerably more on it, you get a lot more paint. So I can start off with a little bit, increase, and you notice I did not take my hand off the trigger and had to readjust separately. And that is why a double action airbrush, that is the basics of why a double action airbrush gives you more control. So you can constantly, it almost becomes, with practice, it becomes second nature. You don't even have to think about what you're doing with that finger, and it becomes quite a natural thing. Okay, so that is the difference. That's the first bit of jargon. The difference between a single action and a double action airbrush. The other question that gets asked quite a lot is people may hear something about gravity feed and siphon feed. Okay, and which one would you use? A gravity feed airbrush is something like this one, where the cup sits on top. Okay, paint actually drops down into the airbrush, into the nozzle, and flows out of it. You also see quite often, particularly in hobby shops, they carry siphon feed airbrushes. As the name implies, siphon literally draws or sucks the paint from the bottom upwards. So they will have a paint cup or a bottle hanging off the bottom of it. Okay, and there is advantages and disadvantages of each time. A siphon feed, as in something that hangs with a bottle on the bottom, excited over there, I think. Will be good for large amounts of paint. You can put big bottles in, and you can still spray it quite effectively. What it's not good at is actually handling very small amounts of paint. Okay, because you need about maybe 2 or 3 mils of paint before it even comes up the airbrush. Okay, depending on the type of airbrush it is. Well, with gravity-fed airbrush, you've got the reverse. It's going to be very hard to see this, but I'm trying to show you. Okay. If you're really keen, you can see just a spot of orange paint on the bottom of that. There's less than half a mil of paint there. Yet, that is very happy to spray that down to the last drop. So gravity-fed brushes are excellent for handling small amounts of paint. And traditionally it's also its disadvantage, because once you get one that's good at small amounts of paint, you can't handle big amounts of paint because of the fixed cup. Our airbrushes, the cup comes off, you can put a big cup on it, so you don't have the disadvantage. And that is the reason why for most of the work I do, whether it's small or big, I use a gravity-fed airbrush as well. So there's less cleaning involved. You can handle small amounts of paint for quite a bit of ease, and it flows a lot more consistently. So the 2 bits of jargon today is single action, double action, gravity feed, siphon feed. There's obviously more jargon, but let's not go through that. Just going through other parts of the airbrush system. Okay, you've got the compressor over here. Okay, in this case, it's an air compressor that doesn't have an air tank. For a lot of what people do, you don't need an air tank. Some people might like one. But what's important with that is, it's got the compressor there. It's got a regulator that lets me adjust the air pressure. If you have a compressor and you don't have a regulator, it's like watering roses or a fire hose. Basically, imagine what that could do to your garden. Same with compressor, compressor and airbrush. Without a regulator, you've got no control. So I can adjust the air pressure on that regulator, and the bit on the bottom here is called moisture trap as well. When you compress air, you get a little bit of moisture, a little bit of condensation. The last thing you want to do is coming out of your airbrush, mixing with paint and onto your model or whatever, like your canvas or whatever else you're doing. So that's designed to take the moisture out, the condensation out. So there's 3 bits in here: the compressor itself, the regulator, allowing you to control the air pressure, and the actual moisture trap. So usually they're built as one unit, so they come with it. Okay, so that's the basics of equipment. In terms of material, for what we're doing, I'm using pretty standard hobby paints, okay? The sort of things you buy from the hobby store. So they're the same paint you would use a paintbrush in to brush my hand. I'm using the same paints. The only difference is I thin it down to make it go through the airbrush. I will thin it down to a thinness. Okay. Paint as is will not go through an airbrush because it's too thick. It will just glue it, gum it up, and will not come out. So I thin it down with thinners. As a rough sort of estimate, maybe half. I got some specific information on recommendations on what sort of thinning you require for people who want more specific information. Okay, so maybe at the end of the workshop, people who have more technical questions or want a bit of one-on-one can come forward to the stand. I'll remind people of that later. But we do thin down paints, but it's pretty much, as a general thing, it's just you use the same material you do a hand painting, just good quality paint that can be thinned down. Okay, for other artists, it could be watercolors. It could be I've done house paint from Bunnings hardware, as long as it's really fine quality, and all sorts of other materials as well. Okay, so nothing different about the materials themselves. So getting to some of the actual models themselves. Okay, I'm going to put these down lower in the stage so people can come up and have a closer look. But basically, all the models here have been mainly airbrushed. Okay, there is obviously some hand brushing involved. But say for example, this little 737 is 90% airbrush, even all the silver edges along the wings and things like that. This Sailor Moon figure here is maybe about 70% airbrushed, with some details picked up by a hand brush as well. That's a much earlier attempt of mine, but I'll show you what I can do. I'll just do a quick rundown on how we actually take a model towards something like that. Okay, so in particular, the models of the figures are resin figures. They start life literally in a bag like this. I didn't bring it with me, but there is one page of handwritten and hand-drawn diagrams in Japanese on how to put it together, and that's basically all you get. So it's kind of like putting together a store mannequin, except you've got to do a lot more work in painting them up and finishing them. So they start off with resin parts like these. There's a lot of surface imperfections and things on it. So a lot of sanding with sanding machines and sandpaper just to get the polish, just to get the surface smooth. And then what we do is just spray paint an undercoat on it to make sure that everything's all smooth and things like that. I am going to attach an airbrush to this and just very lightly spray this again. It's going to be a bit hard to see because I'm just doing that on top white again, but I'm just spraying that just a little bit of white over the areas I've sanded and polished up. I'm getting some nice background music to my demonstration here. Okay. But I'll just do a general white coat on top of that like this. Okay. So I'm going to leave that to dry, but what that does is after you sanded the model, after you fill in all the little joins and cracks like that, you need to give a undercoat of a single colour, just so you can see whether there's any areas where there's imperfections and things. And once again, I'm going to put that down low on the stage for people to have a close look at, and they can see what I mean by that. Once you've got the main, okay. Once you've got the base coat down and everything's to your satisfaction, you can actually start painting the model itself. And this is the example of something that's about halfway completed. So you can see most of the colours on it, the face, the main colours of the flesh and the face on it. I haven't done the eyes, and she's actually meant to be blonde, so I've got to do something about the hair as well. But that gives you an idea about mid-stage in a model like this. I've done the base coat, I'm happy with the way the surface is, now I can add the details to it. And just to, as I add the detail and finish that off, you can then finish the final details by hand, and you end up with a couple of figures like the ones I have completed there. So normally in a workshop like this, I will actually field questions and answer and attempt to answer them. It's a little hard to show in this actual demonstration here, but what do come up at the end of the workshop or go to our stand, because I can show you how fine a line airbrushes can get with hobby paint. You are going to get different results from different materials, but let's just say as a benchmark, hobby model type paints, which is what you would do wargamming with. What scale of wargamming artifacts?
That big would be about the biggest.
Is that a tank or a person?
People.
People. Okay. That's probably about 35th scale, something close to that. Okay. For something like that, an airbrush would be excellent for A. Are they metal by any chance? Are they metal by any chance?
Yeah, the models themselves.
Okay. An application for airbrush for that would be, first of all, metal needs an undercoat of primer, and when you're doing 50 of these figures, it's a bit tedious to do it by brush. The first thing you do is, with an airbrush, you can do an airbrush is that. The base color of the uniforms is very easily to apply as well, and then it'd be a combination of airbrushing shades and oil colours with a brush to bring out the detail. But certainly small scale figures and small scale down to 1/144 scale armour, you can airbrush some of the detail down there. Yep.
Thank you very much.
Next question, please.
What's a good consistency to thin your paint down to run efficiently?
Okay, one thing I didn't cover in detail here, and I can cover more detail back at stand, is we actually use different ratios for different types of work. So even say painting a figure like this, if I'm doing the undercoat, I'll make the paint fairly thick because I just want to cover the whole thing, and that may be about 50-50. But as I get down to the detail of the figure, I want really fine line controls and things like that, I'll make the paint thinner to make it come out of the airbrush easier. So for detail work, I might go down to about 60% thinners and 40% paint, and use a finer nozzle in it as well. So it's not one set ratio. You actually adjust it for the very nature of the work you do. So an airbrush with thick paint be good for covering large areas, and you use a high air pressure. When you go down to detail, you actually reduce the air pressure, thin down the paint, and put your airbrush closer to all your work. So I could be airbrushing as close with the airbrush as close as that. But on the other hand, for larger areas, thick paint, I'll be up here. Is that a general answer? Okay. For those who are interested in specifics, I actually have some information handouts about the techniques. You're welcome to grab one of those as well. Yeah. Next question.
Yeah, closer. Thank you. For people who've got air compressors with adjustable output, what pressure should they run at?
Okay, the air pressure, once again, is something you vary depending on the nature of work you do. But as a range, I tend to airbrush from 8 to 25 psi. Okay, and most of it between 8 and 15. So 25 would be quite extraordinary large things when I do to that. So if you have an existing compressor, like to say you bought one from a hardware store, those half horsepower, 1 horsepower, they can run an airbrush provided you can adjust them down, and most can. They just tend to be a bit big and noisy, but they will work. They're a great introduction. Okay, lady in front's got a question.
Is there a difference in weight between the gravity-fed bottle and the siphon?
Sorry, is there a difference of
Weight and balance when you're using the
I think that comes down to a little bit of personal preference, and one of the best ways, okay, the simple answer is it makes a difference to the person rather than a general rule. I've now grown used to gravity-fed airbrushes, and I much prefer them in terms of the balance. But once again, it does come down to the individual and what they do. I don't like the fact that in a siphon-fed airbrush, I've got a bottle getting in the way of my work, hanging underneath it, because I want to get very close to my model. And if you can imagine if there's a bottle hanging down here, I can't do that. So it's a disadvantage for me for siphon-fed as well. Other people, their techniques and their work may not be the case, and it's best to actually try one or have a good look at the field. But I would say in general, as a rough general thing, the gravity feed will be a little bit better balanced and a little bit less intrusive to work. But you're the best person to answer that yourself by having a go.